If every person you rely on suddenly disappeared, would you still keep moving? Not just surviving, but continuing in the same direction with the same intensity. Most of us never face that question until we are forced to. And when we do, it doesn't arrive like a crisis. It arrives like a slow, quiet evacuation of everything that once felt solid. This video maps what actually happens in the psyche when you must stand completely alone, not as a punishment, but as the beginning of a transformation depth psychologists call individuation. We'll walk through 7 inner transitions that rewire the source of your motivation, self-worth, emotional regulation, and identity. If you are right now in a season where the applause has stopped, the reassurance has vanished, and you feel a strange stillness, this might not be a breakdown. It might be the moment you stop borrowing direction from the outside and begin moving from a foundation no one can take from you. Chapter 1, Transition 1. The rescue fantasy collapses. The first thing that shatters is a silent belief you didn't know you carried. You've been holding something back. A fraction of your effort, your risk, your full presence. Because somewhere deep inside, you believed that if things got too heavy, something or someone would step in. Not a specific person, not a written promise, just a feeling. A quiet assumption that external help would arrive at the right time, in the right form. And this assumption is not a conscious plan. It's an old psychological architecture, built from moments in the past when support did come. Maybe when you were younger and a parent, a teacher, a friend rescued you from overwhelm. Maybe a series of coincidences that taught you, when I reach my limit, something will shift. Over time, that pattern solidifies into a hidden contract. You begin to defer your life, holding back energy for the waiting. But reality doesn't honor contracts it never signed. And there comes a sequence of events, or a single long silence, where no one intervenes. You call out, metaphorically, and hear nothing. You watch for a sign, and nothing changes. The emptiness that follows is not the situation getting worse. It's the inner expectation breaking apart. What collapses isn't your life. It's the illusion of the external savior. Carl Jung once wrote that until you bring the unconscious into awareness, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That blind faith in a rescue is one of the most powerful unconscious directors. It makes you label your delays as bad timing, waiting for the right opportunity, or not having met the right person yet. But when you see the pattern for what it is, you realize the delay has never been dictated by circumstances. You've been holding a piece of your soul in a waiting room, believing someone will open the door. I remember a woman named Sienna, a software developer who stayed inside a tech giant for 7 years. She was good, far more capable than the role demanded, but she never pushed for a leap. She would say, "I think my lead will notice soon. He'll see I'm ready for bigger responsibilities." She overworked. She solved problems silently. She made herself indispensable. But every promotion cycle passed over her. The recognition she waited for never came. One day a new hire, younger, was given the very position she assumed would be hers. The shock wasn't about jealousy. It was the collapse of a storyline. She realized she'd stood still for years, not because the company blocked her, but because she'd anchored her future to a recognition no one was obliged to give. That moment, when the rescue never came, wasn't a failure. It was the first cut of a blade that separates you from an invisible dependence. And here's what makes this transition so painful. When the illusion dies, you feel completely unprotected. Like a climber who discovers the rope they trusted was never tied to anything above. But it is precisely in that unprotected space that you reclaim your ability to move. Because when you stop waiting for a savior, you stop splitting your energy. You become the sole driver of your boat, no longer drifting, hoping a current will carry you to shore. Rhetorical question: what would change in your life tomorrow if you were finally certain that no one was coming to save you? That every step forward had to be generated from your own will, with no reassurance except your own. Consider the psychological concept of learned helplessness. It's often created not by actual powerlessness, but by an expectation that an external force will intervene. Once you dismantle that expectation, you discover a reservoir of agency that was there the whole time, simply misdirected into waiting. The collapse of the rescue fantasy is not despair. It's the first reclamation of authorship over your own life. But this is only the first gate. Because once you accept that nobody is coming, you are left in a startling quiet. And that quiet leads directly into the next, far more subtle transition. Chapter 2. Transition 2. Isolation becomes a gateway to the unconscious. When the waiting ends, your attention no longer has external targets to cling to. At first, this feels like loss, a hollowing out. You try to fill it, but nothing external fits. And then something unsettling begins. Your psychological energy turns inward. Not in a peaceful, meditative way. More like a landscape you've avoided suddenly becoming the only place to stand. You start noticing things that were always there. Snatches of old memory that return without reason. Repetitive emotional patterns you thought you'd outgrown. A persistent worry that now has nowhere to project itself. This is not pathology. It's the beginning of inner perception. You've lived so long directed outward, by goals, feedback, distractions, that the interior world seemed like static. But when outward noise recedes, you discover that the static was a signal you never learned to decode. Jung once said, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved but only outgrown." This phase of isolation is where you start outgrowing the way you used to process your own mind. You realize you've always outsourced meaning to a partner's reaction, a boss's approval, a group's validation. Now, with no one around to reflect you, all that material that once defined you drifts into view, unprocessed. There's an old story, not from Jung, but from a tradition that understood this descent. The Sumerian myth of Inanna. She descends to the underworld, and at each gate she must remove a piece of her royal attire, her status, her outer identity. By the time she reaches the deepest chamber, she is stripped bare, no longer a queen. That undressing is not a punishment. It's a prerequisite for transformation. Isolation functions the same way. When you have no audience, you can no longer wear the garments of your usual persona. What's left is something raw, uncurated, and strangely alive. In this space, old content surfaces, fragmented images, deep insecurities, forgotten dreams. And you assume something has gone wrong. But what if this dark, unlit room of the psyche is the first place you've ever been quiet enough to see what's actually there? Like walking into your own house at midnight, without electricity. You know the furniture is still there. You just never noticed the shape of it. The darkness makes you aware of a world that was invisible, not because it was absent, but because the lights of the outside world were always too bright. Rhetorical question. When was the last time you sat, without a phone, without a task, without a purpose, and simply let whatever was inside emerge without judging it? What surfaces in this phase often disturbs people because it contradicts their public image. The kind, agreeable person finds reservoirs of suppressed anger. The ambitious achiever discovers a deep exhaustion and a longing for stillness. The supportive caregiver meets their own unacknowledged need to be held. None of this means you are broken. It means you are finally meeting the entirety of your psyche, not just the parts that were socially useful. If you're in this phase, you're not falling behind. You're passing through a gate most people avoid. And on the other side of it, you don't become a different person. You become a person who has actually met themselves. Chapter 3. Transition 3. Acting without external recognition. Once you've begun to glimpse what lies beneath the surface, another test appears like a quiet riddle, if no one ever sees. What you do, will you still do it? not perform. Just do. Because much of what you called passion was actually validation in disguise. Not all of it, but a significant portion was tethered to an audience. And when that tether is cut, your motivation doesn't just waver, it collapses somewhere near the center of your chest. You discover that you'd been running on a kind of psychological feedback loop. Neuroscientists know this as the dopamine reward pathway. You act, you receive a positive signal, you repeat. Remove the signal, and the loop weakens. But here's what's fascinating. When you continue to act after the reward disappears, the brain starts to build a different reinforcement mechanism. Motivation begins to arise from the process itself, not the outcome. This is the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic drive, but at a depth that rewires your very sense of purpose. A viewer once wrote to me about a painter named Raphael. For years he exhibited locally, won small awards, sold enough to feel validated. Then life shifted, he moved, lost his network, and found himself in a studio with no upcoming shows. The first few weeks, he couldn't pick up a brush. He said it felt like painting into a void. But after a month of silence, something switched. He started painting just to see what would happen inside him when color hit canvas, not to impress. He told me later, I realized I had been painting for applause, not because the act had its own voice. By the end of that year, his work was unrecognizable, not in style, but in depth. The absence of recognition had forced him to locate the source of his art somewhere internal. He now calls that period the apprenticeship of the soul. Jung wrote, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity." When you no longer need to be seen to continue, you start to act from that necessity. The work becomes an expression, not a transaction. And this changes not just your productivity, but your entire emotional architecture. Every silent action severs another thread that bound you to the world's opinion. How many talents have you let lie dormant because the feedback loop broke? And what might emerge if you pursued something with zero promise of external reward, solely because it needed to exist through you? The transition is subtle. You go from "I need someone to tell me this matters" to the doing itself is the point. And that shift installs a permanent engine inside you, one that doesn't sputter when the audience leaves. But there is a deeper consequence of this shift. When you no longer need external validation for your actions, you also begin to question where your value comes from, and that pulls you into the next, more existential layer. Chapter 4. Transition 4. Unhooking your value from others' reflection. If you manage to continue acting without recognition, the next layer peels back, and it's far deeper. You begin to notice that your entire sense of worth has been a mirror trick. You didn't directly experience value. You experienced the reflection of it in others' reactions. When they smiled, you felt important. When they were distant, your self-worth dropped. It was a constant fluctuation, and you mistook that movement for aliveness. When that reflection is no longer available, when relationships recede, when career identity fades, when you're no longer someone in a visible role, what collapses is not just a good feeling. It's the reference point itself. You don't know where you stand. You've lost the mirror. Jung named this structure the persona, the social mask you show the world. It's necessary for functioning, but the crisis comes when you believe you are the mask. When the mask is removed, you don't just feel unappreciated, you feel non-existent. I heard the story of a man named David, who had always been the emotional pillar in his family and friendship circles. He listened, he calmed crises, he was the one everyone called. That role gave him a solid identity. But after a few life shifts, friends moved away, family dynamics changed. He found himself with no one to support. At first he felt relief, then a chilling emptiness. He said, "I'm still here, but I feel like a ghost. If no one needs me, do I even exist?" That question haunted him for months. He tried rushing into new relationships to rescue people, but it felt hollow. Then came a period where he just sat with the emptiness. He slowly realized that his entire worth construct had been external. He'd been valuable only as a function for others. The mirror was gone, and for the first time he had to ask, what is my value when no one is looking? This stage is often mistaken for depression, but it's more existential. It's the dismantling of an identity that was never truly yours. Jung described the persona as a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. When that system breaks, you enter an undefined state, and the modern world rushes to fill that void with new labels, new groups, new mirrors. But if you can tolerate the emptiness without grabbing a new mask too quickly, something remarkable starts to grow. An internal source of value, independent of reflection. Psychologically, we often talk about self-esteem as if it's something you can bolster with affirmations. But genuine self-esteem doesn't come from telling yourself you're great. It comes from being able to hold a sense of worth, even when every external signal says otherwise. That can only be built in the silence where there is no applause. It's the difference between a house that stands because it's leaning on nearby buildings, and a house that stands because its own foundation is deep. You might slowly sense that worth isn't something that gets confirmed. It's like the sun. It doesn't need a mirror to shine. When you no longer need to see your reflection to know you exist, you step into a stability that is immune to applause and rejection alike. Rhetorical question. If nobody ever praised you again, would you still respect the person you are becoming? If something in you resonates at this point, leave a quiet signal in the comments, just the word real. Not for me, but as a marker for yourself that you're detaching from the old mirror. Chapter 5, Transition 5. The Great Withdrawal of Energy Libido Return. When you stop chasing external reflections, a deeper movement begins, an event Jung called the withdrawal of libido from external objects. He used the word libido to mean psychic energy, not just sexual drive. For years, your energy has been invested in people, ambitions, possessions, future visions. Those investments created a sense of forward momentum. But when the people and goals that used to carry your energy no longer hold the same charge, something disorienting happens. The river of your life seems to dry up. You feel unmotivated, indifferent, like nothing pulls you anymore. And you assume you've lost your drive. But the truth is, no energy has been lost. It has stopped flowing outward and has begun to accumulate in the interior. This is a rare and precious phase that our culture mislabels as stagnation. Inside, pressure is building. Think of a dam blocking a river. From the outside, the landscape looks still. The rushing water is gone. But behind the dam, a vast reservoir is forming. That stored energy, if given time, will eventually carve new channels. Jung insisted that psychological energy is not a static quantity but a dynamic process, always transforming its expression. The withdrawal phase is not apathy. It's the prelude to a different kind of output. I often think of the poet Emily Dickinson, who lived much of her later life in near total seclusion, not recognized by the literary world. Her energy didn't disappear into depression. It concentrated into a corpus of nearly 1,800 poems, most unpublished, written without an audience, purely as an inner necessity. That same concentrated energy later reshaped literature. She didn't withdraw because she was broken. She withdrew because the outside world couldn't hold what was forming inside. Similarly, many people who go through a dark night of the soul, a period where nothing external seems to work, are actually in a gestation phase. The energy that once went into jobs, relationships, social climbing, is now descending into the unconscious, fertilizing new potential. The problem is that our culture only values output, not incubation. So when you're in the withdrawal, people say you're wasting time or losing yourself. but they can't see the internal construction site. In your own life, this phase will feel like a loss of ambition. But maybe ambition was just a proxy for the need to be seen. When you stop needing to be significant in the world's eyes, your energy reorganizes around a new center. It might turn into a creative project, a deeper understanding, a spiritual inquiry, or simply into a quiet strength that doesn't need to prove itself. Micro cliffhanger. The difficult part is that you are in the dark while the reservoir fills. You don't know what's being built. But staying in that suspension without grabbing for new external objects is the discipline that allows the new structure to crystallize. If you are in a season where nothing excites you, don't panic. Ask yourself, is this emptiness truly emptiness? Or is it a pregnant silence? Because the next transition will depend on what you do with that stored energy. Whether you release it back into the old channels, or let it press you towards something genuinely new. Rhetorical question. What if this flat, uninteresting period is the most creative phase of your life? Simply because you're no longer leaking energy. This withdrawal naturally brings you to a more intimate confrontation with your inner world, and especially with your emotions, which now have nowhere to hide. That leads to the sixth transition. Chapter 6. Transition 6. Learning to contain your own emotions. When the energy has turned inward, you face an immediate and raw challenge: your emotions. No one is around to hold them for you, to soothe you, to listen, and make the intensity manageable. And you discover that you've outsourced emotional regulation your entire life. You'd call a friend. You'd vent. You'd seek a partner's reassurance. Now, all those exits are sealed. The emotions don't vanish. In fact, they feel louder because they have nowhere to go. Anxiety spikes. Sadness lingers. Frustration echoes. And your first instinct is to escape, to find someone, to scroll, to distract. But if you can resist that impulse, a new capacity begins to emerge. The ability to stay with an emotion without acting on it. There's a powerful image from the story of Buddha under the Bodhi tree. As he sat through the night, temptations and inner demons arose, not external monsters, but psychological forces: desire, fear, self-doubt. The story says he didn't fight them. He simply touched the earth and remained present, witnessing them without being moved. That's not repression. It's a profound emotional regulation. He demonstrated that an emotion can be acknowledged, seen in its fullness, and allowed to dissolve on its own without being suppressed or indulged. Jung warned, what you resist not only persists, but will grow in size. Many of us resist uncomfortable emotions by running to someone else. That temporary relief reinforces a pattern: I can't handle this alone. But when you are forced to be alone, you must learn to sit beside your inner storms and watch them. Gradually, you notice something astonishing. Emotions have a natural lifespan. They arise. They peak. They fade. You are not their victim. You are the container. This doesn't mean becoming a cold, unfeeling person. It means no longer requiring a human crutch to return to center. Imagine standing on the shore of a wild ocean. You can't stop the waves, but you can learn not to be pulled under. That's emotional containment. Feeling fear without panicking. Feeling grief without shattering. Feeling anger without lashing out. The emotion is allowed, but it no longer dictates action. For many, this is the most frightening transition because it's so visceral. But once you cross it, you gain a freedom that is rare. You can walk into any situation, any relationship, any loneliness without desperation, because you're no longer using others as emotion regulators. Your presence in relationships becomes less needy and more generative. You stop asking your partner to be your therapist, and you start bringing a regulated nervous system into the connection. That alone can transform the quality of all your interactions. Rhetorical question. If you could fully feel your most overwhelming emotion right now, without running or calling anyone, what would you discover at its core? If you've ever deliberately stayed with discomfort instead of reaching for your phone or a person, share a story in the comments. This is a silent brotherhood of those learning to hold themselves. And this capacity to hold yourself emotionally prepares the ground for the final, most integrative transition, an identity that no longer needs any environment to affirm it. Chapter 7. Transition 7. Identity becomes independent of environment. When you contain your own emotions and stop seeking external validation, a final integration takes place. Your identity untethers from its surroundings. Before you knew yourself through roles, parent, professional, partner, the smart one, the reliable one. Those roles gave you a narrative. But as the previous steps dissolve those external anchors, you're left with a kind of naked awareness. You no longer have a clear definition to hold, yet you're not lost. You're simply undefined in a way that feels deeply free. This can be unsettling. I met a former executive named Camille, who after retirement felt he had evaporated. No one sought his decisions. No one respected his title. He said, "I used to be a person of influence. Now I'm just Camille having coffee." But over months, without trying to reclaim a role, something unexpected happened. He started to notice a subtle presence that had always been there, underneath the executive, underneath the father, underneath the achiever. It wasn't another role. It was a silent center of awareness, unlabeled, uncategorized. He described it as becoming a verb instead of a noun. He still engaged with the world, but he no longer needed an identity card to exist. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." This trueness isn't a final fixed label. It's the capacity to live without clinging to any particular self-image. Neuroscience supports this too. The narrative self, the story we tell about who we are, is constructed by the brain integrating memory, social feedback, and self-perception. When external feedback diminishes, the old narrative can melt, and a more fluid, present-centered awareness emerges. This isn't identity loss. It's liberation from a story you outgrew. From the outside, you might look uncertain, but inside there's a calm clarity. You stop asking, "Who am I?" and start living the answer directly. You can adapt to new circumstances without feeling fragmented, because you're no longer a mosaic of other people's impressions. You're a whole, undefined center. This is the culmination of the journey. Not becoming someone else, but becoming unbound from the need to be anyone in particular. When you can stand without a role, without a mirror, without the promise of rescue, you are not isolated. You are free, and that freedom allows you to move through the world with a quiet authority that isn't imposed, but emanates. Rhetorical question. If you stop defining yourself for a whole month, no labels, no stories, what might surface that has been waiting to live through you? And so, the arc completes. But there is a subtle danger here. The ego might try to cling to this new undefined identity as a superior label. The true mark of this stage is that you don't even need to call yourself free or awakened. You simply live, without needing to narrate yourself to yourself. That is the deepest independence. Conclusion. If you look back at these 7 transitions, you'll notice a pattern. Each one removes an external support that you once believed was essential. The rescue fantasy collapses. Isolation opens the door inward. You learn to act unseen. You unhook your worth from others. Your energy withdraws to gather new potency. You become your own emotional container, and your identity sets itself free from definitions. Bit by bit, you stop being a dependent satellite and become a self-luminous star. What's striking is that none of this requires dramatic external change. It's an internal revolution, that can happen in the middle of ordinary life. The person who completes this journey isn't necessarily more successful by society's standards, but they are radically more whole. They no longer chase validation, no longer fear solitude, no longer collapse when recognition fades. They carry a foundation that no one gave them, and no one can steal. The path is not easy. Many turn back at the first silence because it feels like annihilation. But if you're still here, still watching, still feeling resonance, then you've already begun. You're not behind. You're moving in a direction few dare to enter. If this video touched something deep, share it with someone who is walking their own silent path, and subscribe to this channel for more explorations into the hidden architecture of the human psyche. The journey isn't about becoming someone else. It's about no longer needing to become anything but what you already are at the deepest level, waiting to be recognized by you. Write a single word in the comments: foundation. Not for anyone else, but as a